In the quiet suburb of Norwood, Massachusetts, nestled along the tree-lined streets of Prospect Avenue, the Summers family appeared as ordinary as any other. David Summers, a hard-working mechanic, had lived there with his wife, Lisa, for nearly 10 years. The couple's relationship seemed stable enough from the outside. David was a man of routine, spending long hours at his garage, while Lisa kept their home in order. To their neighbors, they looked like the perfect middle-class family. But appearances were deceiving. Lisa Summers, in her mid-30s, had once been a lively woman, full of energy and ambition. Yet, over the years, her once vibrant personality had faded, dulled by the monotony of her life. She spent her days tidying the house, attending the occasional yoga class, and sipping wine in front of the TV. David was rarely home, always caught up in the demands of his garage, leaving Lisa alone and restless. Enter Officer Daniel Harris. Daniel was new to the Norwood Police Department. With his tall, muscular build and piercing blue eyes, he turned heads the moment he joined the force. As he patrolled the neighborhood, he made it a point to engage with the residents, exchanging pleasantries and ensuring everyone felt safe. It wasn't long before he crossed paths with Lisa. Their first interaction was innocent, a simple greeting as he patrolled down her street. But as time passed, Lisa began to anticipate these chance encounters. Daniel made her feel seen, alive even. His warm smile and the way he looked into her eyes stirred something in her she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, while David was working late, Lisa bumped into Daniel at the local coffee shop. He insisted on buying her a cup of coffee, and they sat down to talk. What began as small talk soon evolved into flirtation. Lisa found herself laughing at his jokes, leaning in just a bit too close, and before long, the line between innocent and inappropriate had blurred. Weeks passed, and their coincidental run-ins became more frequent. Daniel would show up at the grocery store while Lisa was shopping, or he'd stop by her house to check on things when David wasn't home. One warm June evening, with David working late at the garage, Lisa found herself alone again. As if on cue, Daniel pulled up outside in his patrol car. Her heart raced as she opened the door, inviting him inside. That night, everything changed. Sitting on the couch, the tension between them was palpable. The conversation was forced, stilted even, until Daniel finally reached out, placing his hand on hers. Lisa didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. Before she could think, Daniel's lips were on hers, and in an instant, the dam broke. They spent the night tangled in each other's arms, their affair igniting like a wildfire that neither could control. But the story doesn't end there. The weeks that followed were a blur of secret meetings and stolen kisses. Lisa and Daniel couldn't stay away from each other, meeting in cheap motels outside of town or sneaking around during David's long shifts. Every encounter was a rush of adrenaline and guilt, but Lisa was addicted to the thrill of it all. Daniel made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Yet with every kiss, every lie, the weight of her betrayal grew heavier. David, though busy with his work, began to notice subtle changes in Lisa's behavior. She was more distant, her phone glued to her hand, and she would disappear for hours without explanation. At first, he shrugged it off, telling himself that Lisa was simply lonely because of his long work hours. But the longer this went on, the more his suspicion grew. Something wasn't right, and David could feel it in his gut. One evening, David arrived home earlier than usual. Lisa was in the shower, her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. David glanced at it, noticing a new message notification from an unknown number. His curiosity piqued, and before he knew it, he was scrolling through her texts. What he found confirmed his worst fears. There, in explicit detail, were messages from Daniel, messages filled with passion and promises of secret rendezvous. David's world collapsed. His hands shook as he read through the messages, rage and disbelief boiling within him. How could Lisa, the woman he had loved and trusted for years, betray him like this? And with a man who was supposed to protect their community. As Lisa stepped out of the bathroom, her hair wet and wrapped in a towel, she froze at the sight of David standing in the kitchen, her phone in his hand. "David?" she asked, her voice trembling. David looked up, his face a mask of cold fury. "Who the hell is Daniel?" he demanded. Lisa's heart dropped. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth hung in the air, suffocating them both. There was no way out. The lies she had told, the deceit she had hidden, were laid bare in front of her. I can explain," she stammered, but David wasn't interested in explanations. For the next few days, the house was silent. David didn't confront her again, not directly. He simply shut down, retreating into himself, refusing to look at her or speak. Lisa, consumed by guilt and confusion, didn't know what to do. She couldn't bring herself to end the affair, even though she knew it was tearing her marriage apart. Every time she thought about Daniel, her resolve crumbled. David, meanwhile, was slowly unraveling. His anger simmered beneath the surface, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. He hadn't confronted Daniel yet, but the thought of doing so consumed him. Every time he passed the police station, his blood boiled. He spent his nights drinking, drowning his rage in bottles of whiskey while Lisa slept in the other room. Then, on a sweltering August night, everything came to a head. David had been drinking heavily, the heat and the alcohol mixing dangerously in his bloodstream. Lisa, dressed in a thin robe, returned home late. Too late for David's liking. As she entered the living room, she immediately felt the tension in the air. David sat in the armchair, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes dark and filled with fury. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Lisa hesitated, sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface. "I was out. With friends," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. David stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "With friends," he repeated, his tone dripping with venom. "You think I don't know? You think I haven't figured it out?" Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she backed away from him, her heart racing. "David, please." But the story doesn't end there. David's heart thudded in his chest, his mind a storm of anger and confusion. He had never felt this kind of rage before. Every ounce of trust he had placed in Lisa was shattered, and his blood boiled with the betrayal. As Lisa stood in front of him, her eyes wide with fear, David couldn't help but notice the faint scent of cologne on her skin. Daniel's cologne. "How long, Lisa?" David's voice was low, trembling with barely contained fury. "How long have you been sneaking around with him?" Lisa's throat went dry, her pulse racing as she struggled to find the right words. "David, I can explain." "Explain what?" David cut her off, his voice rising. "Explain how my wife, the woman I've worked myself to the bone for, has been sleeping with a cop behind my back." Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes, but she knew there was no way to make this right. "I'm sorry, David. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." "Happened?" David repeated, his face twisting with disbelief. "Happened? You don't accidentally fall into bed with someone, Lisa. You made a choice. You made that choice every single time you went to him." "I was lonely," Lisa snapped, her voice breaking under the pressure. "You were never home. You were always at the garage, working late, leaving me here alone. I didn't want this to happen, but I needed someone who made me feel alive again." David's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it was no use. The anger was too overwhelming. "You should have talked to me," he said, his voice trembling. "You should have come to me, not him." Lisa wiped the tears from her face, her heart aching with guilt and regret. "David, I know I've hurt you. I know I've ruined everything. But it's over now. I ended it with him." "Is it really over?" David asked, his eyes narrowing. "Because every time I see his patrol car drive by, I see the way you look at him. It's not over, is it?" Lisa's silence was enough of an answer. David's jaw tightened as he turned away from her, his mind racing. "I want him out of our lives. I want you to stop seeing him." Lisa hesitated, biting her lip. "David, I don't think it's that simple." David spun around, his eyes blazing with fury. "What do you mean it's not that simple?" "He's persistent," Lisa admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "He keeps coming around. He won't let me end it." David's heart pounded in his chest as he processed her words. "So he won't leave you alone, even after you tried to break it off?" Lisa nodded, her voice breaking. "I'm scared, David. He's been showing up at random times, calling me, texting me. I don't know what to do." David's blood boiled as he heard this. Not only had his wife betrayed him, but now this man, this police officer, was harassing her. Daniel wasn't just a threat to his marriage, he was a threat to their safety. Without saying another word, David grabbed his phone and stormed out of the house. Lisa's voice called after him, but he ignored her, his mind focused on one thing: ending this once and for all. It didn't take long for David to find Daniel. He knew exactly where to go. The officer's patrol car was parked outside the small diner just outside of town, the same place Lisa had met him for coffee all those weeks ago. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he parked across the street, his heart racing with adrenaline. He could see Daniel inside, sitting at the counter, casually sipping his coffee as if nothing in the world was wrong. David's mind raced with thoughts of confrontation, of violence, of doing whatever it took to make sure Daniel Harris never came near his wife again. But he knew he had to be smart about this. Daniel was a cop, and if things got out of hand, it would be David who ended up in handcuffs. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before stepping out of the car. As he walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingled, drawing Daniel's attention. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition on Daniel's face, a brief flash of guilt. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by a cocky smirk. "Well, well," Daniel said, leaning back in his seat. "David Summers, to what do I owe the pleasure?" David didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked right up to Daniel, his voice low and dangerous. "Stay away from my wife." Daniel raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I'm not sure I know what you're talking about." "Don't play games with me," David growled, his fists clenching at his sides. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. It ends now, Daniel. You stay away from Lisa, or so help me." "Or what?" Daniel interrupted, leaning forward, his smirk widening. "What are you gonna do, David? You think you can just waltz in here and scare me off? I'm not afraid of you." David's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. "This isn't a game, Daniel. I know you've been harassing her. I know you've been showing up at the house, calling her, texting her. It stops now." Daniel's smile faded slightly, and for the first time a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "She came to me," he said, his voice dropping. "She's the one who started this." David's blood boiled as he fought the urge to punch Daniel right there and then. "She ended it," he said through gritted teeth. "And if you don't leave her alone, I'll make sure you regret it." Daniel chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You think you can threaten me, David? I'm a cop. No one's going to believe you if something happens to me." David's fists clenched tighter, his nails digging into his palms as he struggled to keep his composure. He knew Daniel was right. The power imbalance between them was undeniable. If David laid a hand on him, it would be his word against the police officers, and there was no telling how that would play out. But David wasn't going to let Daniel win. He turned on his heel and left the diner without another word, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't done with this, Far from it. But he needed to be smart about how he handled things. As the days passed, the tension between David and Lisa grew unbearable. Lisa was a wreck, constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid that Daniel would show up at any moment. David, meanwhile, was consumed by rage. Every time he saw Daniel's patrol car pass by their house, it was like a slap in the face, a reminder of the man who had torn his life apart. One evening, after another long, silent dinner, David sat in the living room nursing a glass of whiskey. Lisa was upstairs, avoiding him as usual. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and when he saw the message, his blood ran cold. It was from Daniel. "I'll be seeing her soon. You can't stop this." David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the message, his hands trembling with rage. That was it. He had tried to handle this the right way, but Daniel had crossed a line. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore. It was about protecting Lisa from a man who was clearly unstable. He stood up, grabbing his car keys, and stormed out of the house without a word. His mind was a blur of anger and adrenaline as he drove through the streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain. This ended tonight. When he reached Daniel's house, it was dark and quiet, but David knew he was inside. He parked his car down the street and walked up to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. Without hesitation, he pounded on the door, his fists hitting the wood with a force that rattled the frame. "Open up, Daniel," David shouted, his voice echoing through the empty street. "I know you're in there." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open, and Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression smug as ever. "Well, look who it is," Daniel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you doing here, David? Come to beg for your wife back?" David's eyes darkened as he stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're done, Daniel. You hear me? This ends now. But the story doesn't end there." Before David could react, Daniel's smirk faded and his hand shot out, grabbing something from behind the door, a gun. David's heart skipped a beat as he saw the weapon, but he didn't back down. "You think I'm scared of you?" David growled. "You're nothing but a coward." In a flash of anger, Daniel raised the gun, pointing it directly at David's chest. "Get out of here, David. Before you make a mistake, you'll regret." But David wasn't thinking anymore. The rage had taken over, clouding his judgment. In a split second, he lunged forward, grabbing Daniel's arm. The two men struggled, their bodies crashing into the walls of the narrow entryway. The gun went off, a deafening bang that echoed through the house. David stumbled back, clutching his side, his shirt quickly soaking with blood. He gasped for breath as he collapsed onto the floor, his vision fading. Daniel stood over him, his chest heaving as he looked down at David's crumpled form. The gun still smoked in his hand, and for a brief moment he looked horrified by what he had done.